He walked into that quiet diner the same way he had for years. Calm, steady, just looking for a warm meal. But this time, a single hateful glance turned into something far worse. An old veteran, targeted because of the color of his skin, struck in front of a room full of people too stunned or too afraid to move. No one knew it yet, but that moment would set off a chain of events no one in that town would ever forget. And the man who thought he could get away with it was about to learn a lesson he never saw coming. But if he had known who was on their way, he might have kept his hands to himself. He'd been coming to that little roadside diner for years, long enough that people didn't just know his name, they knew his stories. Earl was the kind of man who moved through the world with quiet dignity, the kind earned through decades of service and a lifetime of trying to do right. At 81, his routine was simple. Morning coffee, a brief chat with a waitress, and a peaceful moment by the window where he could watch the town wake up. Most days, no one paid him more than a respectful nod. He was part of the place, steady, familiar, harmless. But that morning felt different the moment the biker walked in. Earl noticed the look, the way it lingered longer than it should have. Not curiosity, not recognition. Something sharper, colder. He tried to ignore it. Men like him had learned long ago to swallow more than they ever should have had to. But even before the first word was spoken, before the diner went silent, Earl sensed it, the shift in the room, the way a single hateful presence could poison the air. He didn't know how bad it was about to get. Not yet. But something inside him whispered that trouble had just taken a seat only a few tables away. And if he'd known what was about to unfold, he might have braced himself, because this wasn't going to end in that diner. It was only the beginning. The moment the biker stepped toward Earl, the air in the diner tightened, like everyone inside had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. It wasn't just a slap that shattered the room. It was the reason behind it, the quiet but unmistakable venom in the man's eyes, the kind Earl had spent his whole life navigating, the kind that didn't see an old veteran, didn't see a human being, just a target. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the sting of recognition. He'd felt this before in another lifetime, in places where men like him were expected to keep their heads down and take whatever was thrown their way. Travis Murdoch didn't know Earl's history, didn't know about the service, the medals, the sacrifices, but he didn't need to. To him, Earl's age, his calmness, and most of all his skin were enough to spark the cruelty he carried like a badge. Earl stayed still, not because he was weak, but because he learned that reacting too fast, too boldly, too loudly could turn a bad moment into something far worse. The people around him froze too, some out of fear, some out of shock, some because they'd seen this kind of ugliness before and didn't know how to stop it. Travis strutted around like he owned the room, tossing out snide remarks and letting his buddies laugh on cue, filling the diner with a darkness that made even the fluorescent lights feel dim. Carla tried to speak up, but backed away when one of the bikers glared at her, the kind of glare that said she should remember her place. Earl's phone felt heavy in his hand, not out of fear, but from the weight of deciding whether this was a moment worth calling his son about. Eventually, he typed 2 words. Come now? He didn't add why. He didn't need to. Outside, the morning rolled on like nothing was happening. People walked by. Cars passed. But inside, Earl sat surrounded by silence that felt like a storm gathering in the distance. Travis kept his boots up on the chair, loud and careless, bragging about past fights, past victims, past moments where he'd used intimidation as a shield for his own emptiness. His friends laughed, but their laughter kept cracking, like even they knew he was playing with fire this time. Earl didn't acknowledge the taunts. He just stared out the window, listening for the sound he knew would come if his son had seen the message. Minutes passed, slow and sharp. More people entered the diner, instantly sensing the tension, instantly seeing the red mark on Earl's face. Whispers spread quietly, but no one dared intervene. Some didn't want to get involved. Some didn't believe stepping in would help. And some, heartbreakingly, had grown used to scenes like this, moments where a black man was humiliated while others watched, helpless or unwilling. As Travis grew louder, the injustice grew heavier, settling across the room like dust after an explosion. Earl's heartbeat remained steady, but something inside him tightened. A familiar ache he thought time had dulled. The ache of knowing that even decades after serving his country, even after giving everything he had to protect others, he could still be dehumanized in an instant. The ache of knowing his silence was both a shield and a burden. Then, faint at first, but growing steadily, came the low rumble of diesel engines rolling down the street. Earl didn't move, didn't smile, didn't claim victory. But the sound shifted the air. Travis paused mid-sentence, brow furrowed as the engines grew louder, closer, undeniable. Conversations stopped again. People turned to the windows. Something was arriving, something bigger than the hate that had poisoned the room. And in that moment, even Travis seemed to sense that the balance was about to shift in a way he couldn't control. If he had known who was inside those trucks, he might have walked out while he still had the chance. The door of the diner swung open, and the room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Calvin stepped in first, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced real danger countless times and returned. Behind him, the rest of his platoon fanned out, each man radiating discipline and control, their presence alone a statement. They were not here for theatrics. They were here to uphold justice. Travis Murdoch's smirk faltered the instant he saw them, but pride forced him to lean back in his chair, trying to mask the unease that bubbled beneath the surface. The contrast was stark. On one side, a man who demanded respect through intimidation. On the other, men whose very posture commanded it naturally, without a word. Calvin's gaze didn't waver as he moved toward his father's booth. Earl sat there, coffee cup in hand, calm but scarred, his face still red from the slap, the humiliation lingering like smoke in the air. But his eyes, steady and unwavering, told the story of a man who had survived far worse, and of a son who would not allow the injustice to stand. The diner seemed to shrink, the fluorescent lights flickering as though sensing the tension, the chatter fading into silence. Travis tried to fill the space with laughter and loud boasts, recounting imagined fights and past dominance, but the sound fell flat, hollow, even to his own friends. They shifted nervously, uncomfortable with the weight of what was about to happen, and slowly began to realize they weren't in control anymore. Calvin didn't shout, didn't need to. Every step toward Travis was deliberate, measured, the kind of movement that communicated more than words ever could. When he stopped a mere few feet away, his presence alone forced Travis to look up, to confront the reality that he was no longer facing a passive victim. Calvin's voice, low and steady, cut through the thick silence. "You're going to apologize to my father." It wasn't a demand. It was truth, heavy and undeniable. Travis's pride flared, and he stood abruptly, chair legs scraping harshly across the tile, trying to reclaim space that had slipped beyond his control. His friends shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes, some leaning back, unwilling to back him up. The diner felt almost claustrophobic, every movement amplified, every breath counted. Calvin leaned in slightly, his voice steady but piercing, recounting the years of Earl's service, the sacrifices he made, the battles fought for a country that still allowed men like Travis to humiliate him. The words weren't just directed at Travis. They reverberated through the diner, a reminder to every onlooker that injustice didn't go unnoticed, that courage wasn't measured by size or bravado. Earl's gaze softened, a subtle nod of pride acknowledging his son's strength, while Travis's shoulder began to slump, the smirk fading as the truth hit him. His voice trembled when he tried to respond, a thin attempt at denial, but the room was silent. Every eye locked on him, weighing him, judging him. And then the sound outside shifted everything. The faint rumble of engines growing steadily louder, the unmistakable presence of vehicles arriving in the street. Travis's eyes darted to the window, a flicker of panic breaking through the last offenses of his arrogance. He knew, in that instant, that he wasn't facing just Earl and Calvin. He was facing a force he had never anticipated, a reckoning that extended beyond words or threats, a wall of people who would not allow him to escape the consequences of his actions. The tension inside the diner reached a breaking point, every heartbeat echoing the realization. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no turning back. If he had known who else was walking toward that door, who had already answered his father's call in less than 22 minutes, Travis might have thought twice before crossing the line. But now, the choice was gone. The storm was here, and the lesson was about to be delivered. The room exhaled as the tension finally broke. Travis slouched back into his chair, his anger spent, his bravado shattered, and for the first time that morning he looked small, exposed, and human in a way that didn't command fear. Earl lifted his coffee cup once more, calm and unshaken, the weight of decades of service and sacrifice resting quietly in his posture. Around him, the diner slowly returned to life, customers whispering, servers exhaling, conversations resuming, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The air was still thick with the memory of what had happened, with the echo of injustice that had just been confronted, and with the stark reminder that the courage to stand up, even in the face of hatred, can shift the balance of a room, a town, a community. Earl didn't gloat. He didn't relish revenge. He simply sat with a quiet dignity that had carried him through wars, through struggles, through a lifetime of fighting battles bigger than himself. Every wrinkle on his face, every scar visible or hidden, told a story of resilience, of a man who had faced both the horrors of war and the quiet cruelties of prejudice, and yet still chose integrity over anger, presence over violence. His son, Calvin, remained close by, eyes scanning the diner, posture relaxed but alert, a silent testament that some battles are never fought alone. The bikers, the once threatening presence that had filled the room with menace, were now diminished, not by force, but by the simple fact that the right people showed up at the right time, unafraid to confront injustice with resolve rather than retaliation. And in that moment, everyone in the diner could feel the magnitude of what had just occurred. A small town had witnessed a stand against the kind of hate that too often goes unchecked, that too often hides behind ignorance and intimidation. The lesson was unmistakable. Racism is not only about the physical act, the visible slap, or the public humiliation. It is about the fear it instills, the quiet control it attempts to assert over lives, and the way it erodes dignity unless met with courage. Outside the diner, the engines of the trucks faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. Inside, the room was forever altered. People who had been bystanders, unsure when or how to act, had witnessed what it meant to confront injustice, to refuse complicity, and to stand firmly on the side of respect and humanity. Carla, the waitress, paused, her hand still on the coffee pot, taking in the enormity of what had happened and understanding, in a way she hadn't before, that the courage of a single act can ripple outward, challenging everyone who observes it to reflect, to question, to act. Even the teenager in the corner, who had watched wide-eyed from his booth, felt something shift within him. The understanding that standing by silently is a choice, and sometimes the wrong one. Earl's calm defiance, his son's unwavering support, the quiet power of presence and integrity. These were reminders that the fight against injustice is continuous, often uncomfortable, and always necessary. Racism, prejudice, and cruelty do not exist only in headlines or distant communities. They live in the moments we ignore, in the places we assume we are safe, and in the spaces where fear keeps people silent. But they can also be challenged, resisted, and confronted with courage, dignity, and solidarity. This wasn't just a story about a slap, a biker, or even an old veteran. It was a story about the courage required to claim humanity in a world that too often denies it. And as Earl slowly sipped his coffee, the quiet strength in his posture leaving an imprint on everyone in that room, the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, echoing far beyond the walls of Mel's country diner. How many more will have to endure this kind of humiliation, this kind of hatred, before we, as a society, decide that enough is enough? How many more acts of courage will it take to remind the world that respect is not optional and dignity is not negotiable? This was a victory, yes, but also a challenge, a call to anyone who witnesses injustice to ask themselves, will you act or will you stay silent? The story didn't end with the slap. It ended with a lesson that was bigger than any single moment. A lesson about humanity, accountability, and the courage it takes to demand justice in a world that so often tries to look away.